Well, good morning. I'm Jared Pigeon, pronouns he, him. I serve as the diversity officer at Minnesota State University Moorhead, and I direct the Office of Diversity and Inclusion. As we get started today, I would like to acknowledge the ancestral land in which I sit on as being the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, and Dakota First Nations. We honor and celebrate our indigenous peoples that came before us and those amongst us. Thank you for joining us for the third session in the six-part Building Inclusive and Equitable Workplaces training series. Some additional diversity, equity, and inclusion resources we'd like to make you aware of is it's important to note that the work of becoming more diverse and equitable and inclusive is a journey, not only within our workplaces, but also as individuals. With the understanding that this work extends beyond the 6 training sessions, I would like to share with you 2 additional resources. First, through the Professionals of Color program, the Chamber has a webpage dedicated to providing an initial list of books to read, Fargo Moorhead and West Fargo Black-owned businesses, and other various resources and references. To view this webpage, please visit fmwfchamber.com/POC. Second, LinkedIn has recently made 14 learning paths available for free until March 2021. One of the sessions, titled Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging for All, pairs strongly with this Building Inclusive and Equitable Workplaces training and covers additional topics such as confronting biases, skills for inclusive conversations, communicating across cultures, and much more. To view this training, visit LinkedIn and search Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging for All. Again, I would like to thank you for joining us this morning for the third training, Unconscious Biases. Self-awareness leads to organization awareness. If you were unable to view the first 2 sessions after today's training, you can view the recordings on the same webpage you are viewing this live stream. Before I turn it over to Kira, just a couple of notes. As you are listening along, please feel free to utilize the question and answer tab or the discussion feature on the right side of the live stream. If you would like to ask your question anonymously, please feel free to enter anonymous into the required name box. We have time reserved at the end for questions. The Chamber team will distribute a post-event survey as well as a SHRM and HRCI codes if you are seeking continuous education credits tomorrow afternoon. The event recording will also be published on this webpage once it's prepared. And if you wish to share today's webinar with a colleague or watch it, please feel free. Finally, your registration for today's event is good for the remaining 4 sessions. The Chamber team will send out event reminders with the link, which will remain the same as each upcoming session approaches. Now, please help me welcome our presenter, Kira Kimball. Kira, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to be with you to talk about unconscious bias and how self-awareness, when we look at ourselves as individuals and recognize those biases, can really lead to organizational awareness and better decisions regarding people. Can you believe we are already in our 3rd session for Building Inclusive and Equitable Workplaces that the Chamber is bringing forward? And I hope you'll put on your calendar October 22nd for our next session. The learning outcomes I hope to accomplish with you include insight into how unconscious biases are formed, vocabulary and definitions around unconscious bias, certainly looking at the impact and how unconscious bias can really impact the workplace. And then finally, I want you to have some strategies and tactics that you can take to go, ways that you can start interrupting and slowing down unconscious bias. Since this is a recording, we are looking at ways to bring forth the SHRM and HRCI credits. You will be hearing from the chamber on these possibilities. So a quick diversity refresher. I am relentless on this slide. At some point in the series, I'll probably quiz you on it. That diversity is much bigger than race, ethnicity, gender, and age. And there is a full picture. And as we look at our workplaces, this definition is critical for us to remember and to put in place when we think of our colleagues and how they enter the workplace. So before we get started, I want you to take just a few seconds here, and I want you to think about your current circle of influence. Whether you have a piece of paper next to you or can just think about this, this is a great baseline activity. And the reason why we do this activity during the unconscious bias training is because it brings some awareness to ourselves about the people who we are closest to. So if you thought right now about the 3 to 5 individuals in your life who have the biggest influence on you, who you would consider your advisors, confidants, friends, who are not your family nor your romantic partner, I want you to think about those people. And then I want you to do an assessment based on their gender, their age, race, sexual orientation, education, and disability. So in thinking about those people, typically what I find when I do this exercise with groups is that they find there's a lot of similarities among the core people that we are in relationship with. And when I did this exercise myself, the first time, I found the exact same thing. And this can have something to do with unconscious bias. And what we're going to talk about throughout this webinar is how we can interrupt those ways of thinking and hopefully build new patterns of behavior as well as thought. So keep this idea of circle of influence. Harken back to inclusive leadership as well. And I would invite you to consider taking the same assessment in about 6 months after you start practicing these new behaviors and thought patterns. Let's take a look at some definitions so we can operationalize them together. When I'm talking about unconscious, I'm talking about the part of the mind which is inaccessible to the conscious mind that can impact our behavior and our emotion and our way of thinking. Really, this is being unaware or not knowing. When we think about bias, I'm talking about having a strong inclination, a preconceived opinion about something or someone. And the reality is a bias can be favorable or unfavorable. An example might be that I am looking over the delivery room in a hospital and I say, boy, is that baby the cutest in the whole delivery room, but I might be biased because that's my nephew. Or maybe I'm looking over a bunch of suits because I want to expand my wardrobe. I have a bias for that because it's blue, as an example. So there's really no punitive judgment in developing those specific biases, and those aren't the dangerous ones, but there can be some that can get in the way of business. So when we look at the definition of unconscious bias, this is where I'm operating from. The ingrained habits of thought that, when left unchecked, may lead to errors in how we perceive, remember, reason, value, and make decisions, especially about people. So these ingrained habits of thought, when we recognize them, when we name them and we substitute new thinking, there can be some good news. Because the reality is, when we look to Daniel Goleman, and many of you probably are very familiar with emotional intelligence, which is a critical skill for leadership these days, that the simple act of naming a bias, recognizing that I have one, or objecting to it on the spot, calling it out and saying, Kira, this is something I want you to be aware of, how you make decisions or how you talk to people. It establishes a social atmosphere that discourages it. So really, throughout this session, I want you to think about what are some of your own biases, my own biases, so that we can name them and hopefully do different. And in our workplaces, when we think about lifting up diversity, equity, and inclusion, it will be important for us to name it and to confront it and to do different. Because if we don't, that is complicit and condones those behaviors. So recognizing our biases, naming them, and substituting new ways of thinking are going to be critical for our success. So let's talk about how our biases really formed. And I'm going to look to the research in cognitive psychology about how we process information and how we make decisions, judgments, evaluations about that information. Research tells us that we can bring in 11 million bits of information at any given moment. 11 million. That is overwhelming. And can you imagine sitting down to process every single bit of information that is coming into our brain? That is completely impossible, right? There's no way that we could make decisions, advance, have process with that many decision points because it's too many for our brain to process. The flip side of the research says that we can only process about 40 bits of that information, 11 million to 40 pieces of information. So our brain has to do something with that 10 million plus bits of information that come into our thinking. And that's where we think of shortcuts. So I'd like you to think about your computer and your favorite program or document that you interact with. My hunch is that you've put it on your desktop for easy access. So you don't have to go into the system, go into the shared database that it might be in, go to the drive, go to the folder, and finally go to that file. Instead, you create a shortcut to your desktop for easy access. And so you don't have to go through all of those processes to get to it. This is what's happening in our brains with that 11 million pieces of information. I also liken it to when I leave my house and I go to my office downtown. I live in Southwest Sioux Falls, so I've got about a 25-minute commute to get downtown. And when I back out of my driveway and I head to Marion Road, I don't consciously stop and say, is there a left or a right here? And when I make that left and I get onto 49th, I don't see that stoplight and try to make a decision. What do I do about that red light or that green light? And when I see the on-ramp to the interstate, I don't consciously make a decision about that either. It's very similar to what's being written in our brains for biases. In fact, many of you probably have the same experience that I do, is that you find yourself in your office and you're wondering, how the heck did I get there? What red light did I run? Because it's automatic in our thinking. And from an evolutionary basis, it's important for all of us to know that we all have biases. It is about as human as it possibly can get. So I want to let you know there's no judgment here when we evaluate ourselves to see those biases, because we all have them. The process of recognizing them and slowing them down is what makes us different. So from an evolutionary bias, really we see that different seems often unsafe. And that when we experience someone who maybe looks different than we are, talks differently, dresses differently, wears their hair differently, acts differently, that makes us concerned sometimes. And in that concern, that's where the interruption needs to take place, and realize that I might be telling a story of someone who's wearing a headscarf as an example, that I might be making some assumptions, drawing some stereotypes and some conclusions about that person based on what society has said, how I've grown up, what culture deems, what the media says. And in that moment, when I'm beginning to tell someone else's story, that's when the awareness needs to happen for us as leaders and decision makers in our businesses, that we recognize that there is some sort of bias playing out, that we're not listening to that person tell their own story, but that we are telling it before we give them that opportunity. And really, society often reinforces this. And when we grow up between the ages of 6 and 8, a lot of these biases come to play because of what we see coming from our parents or our caregivers or what we see in school. So that's really how these biases are formed. And they can be very strong, and we can have great unawareness because they are hardwired, if you will, into our thinking. And the shortcut in decision making can really help us in some instances, but it can also get us in the way. So I want to do a brief activity. Most of us know gender bias, that there are stereotypes that we've seen written in society and culture that identify how people who identify as men or people who identify as women act or think, or perhaps the characteristics they have, or even the jobs or careers they have. So I want to take just a brief moment here. I'd ask you to close your eyes or to maybe open your brain a little bit, because I'm going to throw out some words and I want you to think about one question. Do you identify that word with being a man or being a woman in terms of gender? So here we go. Go ahead and close your eyes if you want. Assertive, nurse, emotional, engineer, logical, stays at home, leader, caring, dominant, indecisive, librarian, pilot, gentle, kind, dental assistant, dentist. So I'd like you to take an inventory about what assumptions maybe came up for you with those words, whether they were characteristics or careers. And again, hearken back to society. And I'm 50. And when I was a kid going through grade school and thinking about career exploration, there were often paths for individuals who identified as women or girls and paths for individuals who identified as men or boys. And this is really important when you think about making decisions in your workplaces about who gets advanced and promoted to take on a leadership role, to take on a strategy role, a vision role, a responsibility for a large budget, or representing your brand out of the marketplace. This is critical to be aware of. So how many biases are there? I promise we won't go through every single one of them, but there are over 150 different biases. So there's a lot to pay attention to when we're thinking and making decisions about people. I'm going to give you a few examples and really try to see how those play out in the workplace. Overconfidence effect. The tendency to believe we are better than average and be overconfident in the accuracy of our judgments. We see this a lot in the workplace, and sometimes a feeling of overconfidence is valuable because it moves past fear or anxiety that we might have, but it also can get in the way and be problematic in decision making. If we don't bring in different perspectives, especially perspectives that are different than ours, we might be making poor decisions for our business. In-group bias and out-group bias are really critical. In-group bias is perceiving people who are similar to me more positively than people who are different than I am. And I think of my example in networking. When I am going to a network event, when I go in, I look for people, oftentimes not consciously, to meet with who look like me, who might be middle-aged white women, because I know easily how to interact with those people. But when we're making decisions about talent, who to hire, who to promote, who to bring the big prospect or the big innovation idea together, that can be problematic, because that in-group bias is really developing people who are the same as I am, and that brings us to that homogeneity of our organization. And we know when we have sameness, that's when we are not being innovative, ingenious in our problem solving and our solution building. So the in-group bias is critical. The flip side of that story is out-group bias, perceiving people who are different from you negatively than people who are similar to you. So those differences, again, can feel uncomfortable. They can feel threatening at times. And that's why it's so important to actually get to know individuals who are different than we are, so we can interrupt those biases with actual information based on hearing from someone who has that lived experience. So that out-group bias, again, we are getting in the way of developing and promoting individuals because of those differences and seeing to them negatively. Finally, the self-serving bias, believing that my success, one's own success, is all contributed to who I am and personal factors, and that anything that has to do with my failure, it's somebody else. It's an external situation that impacted that circumstance. So looking at these unconscious bias, we know that they play out in our workplace, especially the in-group and out-group bias, at least in my experience. Let's look at a few others. Affinity bias. When you are unconsciously prefer people who share qualities with you, someone who is like you, because again, we're comfortable with that. We know that sameness feels safe, and that difference can feel unsafe and disruptive. So watching out for that affinity bias. Beauty bias. We notice people's appearance and associate with their personal characteristics or their capability. Because we identify someone as attractive, according to our definition, we throw some other assumptions about them. Because they're attractive, we believe that they're going to be the best with people. We believe they're going to have the best ideas or perform at a higher caliber. So that is a dangerous bias to see. And the flip side is that we have assumptions about people that maybe don't fit our definition of beauty as individuals. We make assumptions about their ability. And the reality is, when we slow down and we think about this, a beauty or attraction really has little to do with someone's capability or their personality. Conformity or bandwagon is a big thing, that our views are swayed too much by other people because we want acceptance. And that's really important to us often as human beings. That can be an identifier of being human, that we want acceptance, we want to be liked. So we allow our decisions maybe to be influenced, or our ideas and ways of thinking. And that can get in the way, because the reality is you may have the best idea in the shop about this innovation that you're trying to do, this new product line, this new outcome, but you're allowing yourself to be swayed by someone else's thinking or decision making. Confirmation bias. This is something I know for myself, is that sometimes I seek out people when I am in creation mode for feedback who think like me. Because I know that because they're thinking like me, they're probably going to pat me on the back and say, you're on the right track, Kira, you're thinking broadly, this is good stuff. But when in reality, when you're trying to create something different, you should really be getting feedback from someone who thinks differently than you, so they can poke holes into your kinds of thinking and to make sure that it is a solid idea, project, presentation, you name it. So these are some examples how bias plays out. We've talked about gender, so you have an idea already about gender bias. But these last three, I'm really going to ask you to think about, does this happen in your workplace? The halo effect and the horns effect. They're opposites of each other. The halo effect is when someone has a particularly great feature or perhaps they've done one thing really, really well, that you going forward are going to identify all good things with that person because of that particularly wonderful feature they have, or because they did a great job. So when you think of that, and I see this playing out in my organization and in clients with whom we work, that person, if I do a great job, that I'm going to be the golden child going forward and get all of the opportunities to succeed. And when I'm succeeding, that has everything to do with my career path for promotion, for raise, and for elevation throughout the organization. The flip side is the horns effect. It is when you focus on what you might deem a particularly negative characteristic of an individual. Maybe they're always popping their gum, for example, or maybe they're interrupters and it drives you nuts. But those examples do not dictate what their behavior might look like, or what their behavior might look like going forward if perhaps they work on a project that doesn't go so well. But sometimes in business and in organizations, when someone fails, we make this assumption about them. Kira totally ruined that project, presented poorly with that prospect. We're not giving her another opportunity. And those things are dangerous because if we think about our own career paths as leaders, we know that there've probably been some bumps along the way. I know for myself that I'm glad individuals invested in me even after I made mistakes. So we want to watch out for these biases. And then finally, and this is probably in my experience, one of the most dangerous of the 150 biases is the proximity bias. If you are physically close to the power base, and when I say power base, I'm talking about that decision maker, you are more likely to move ahead. And if you're not close to that power base, your career growth may not go where you want it to go. So I want you to think about yourselves. For those of you who are executive leaders and decision makers, or if you supervise talent, hire talent, or get input from talent, I want you to think about how you listen to people in your organization. Is it because they're 3 feet away from you in the plant? Or maybe their office is just a couple down from you in your workspace? Are they the louder individuals who have some extroversion and some confidence in coming to you with an idea? Because those can influence you as a decision maker because they are close to you or they are coming to you with an idea. In fact, I was doing some consulting with a client last week who really acknowledged that this is a dangerous area for them because they don't have the same expectations of all their supervisors in terms of investing in people. So those supervisors who have individuals who step forward, who maybe are more extroverted and more confident with their ideas, they are limiting because they're not listening to those introverts who might be a little bit quieter, might need to be invited to the table, a safer space. And when we really think of underrepresented populations who might not see themselves in the organization because they are maybe 1, 2, 3 individuals represented, their confidence in coming forth to the decision maker can really be undermined. So as inclusive leaders, hearkening back to the presentation a couple weeks ago, we want to make sure that we're going out and we're inviting input and that we're creating relationship, not based on proximity, but based on inclusive leadership and inviting all to the table. So right now, I'd really like to take an opportunity to show a video that talks about recruitment and how a letter can make a difference in an individual's opportunity. So we're going to queue up that video, and I want you to think about how this plays out, if it does play out in your workplace or if it could.
I'm Jose Zamora, and I had to drop a letter to get the title. Every morning I wake up, go on Craigslist and apply to as many jobs, every job that I feel qualified for. About 50 to 100 a day for months. No phone calls, no emails, nothing. One day I just thought, what if I try Joe? Just remove the S in my name and maybe I can make some dollar signs. The Monday I decided to go from Jose to Joe, 7 days later, the next Monday, that's when all the responses started coming. That's when all the replies and emails. The position is open, we want to meet with you, call us back. I was applying for the same exact jobs, the exact same resume, the exact same experience, just a different name. Sometimes I don't even think people know or conscious or aware that they're judging, even if it's by a name, but I think we all do it all the time.
When I back up and I just think about myself as a human being, and I think about my job and the jobs that I've had over my career, and I invite you to think about this as well, that I've needed these jobs. I have worked because certainly I get joy out of it, but I work so I can save for my retirement, so I can have a home, so I can buy groceries, so I can have a car, so I can take care of my family, whatever that might be. And I would invite you to insert what's important to you. Most of us work because we have to. And if we're fortunate, we can find a job that we absolutely love. And so when I hear Jose's story, that he had the experience that his name got in the way of him getting a job and having access to opportunity. And in sometimes it's basic needs for some individuals, water, food, shelter, clothing, safety kinds of things. That is really profound. And for those of us who are in decision-making business roles, like our HR business partners, for example, when they receive resumes and have the huge responsibility. And I don't think we give them enough credit. It is a huge responsibility to help create that pipeline or to forward on resumes to the hiring manager or to think about if they are the hiring person, who to invite. And Jose's experience is not unusual. Throughout the world, research shows that individuals whose names may not mirror the majority, if you will, that there can be some judgment about their capability as an employee. And Jose had that experience when he dropped that letter indicating Jose to Joe. He started getting opportunities for interviews, and for someone to have to cover their name, think about that. Maybe your name is Maximilian, or maybe it's Toby, and we're not sure what that gender might be, or Hector, or Wei Chen, so many different names that one's name can get in the way. So it's really important, and we will talk about this in webinar number 5 about recruitment strategies for diverse talent sourcing to make sure that we're following protocol to best set us up for success. So we're not leaving out that talent, because we can be missing a great difference maker in our organization, but we also have to recognize the impact that we have on people's lives when we make these types of decisions. So many employers, because they recognize the bias that can come in terms of decision making, are blinding names, are blinding zip codes, maybe not looking at schools that individuals attend, because again, we make some assumptions and we write some stories, or we have that affinity bias because, wow, Kira went to Minnesota State University Moorhead and is interviewing for a position here. We know that, dragons are great. We've got to interview her. So these things can get in our way. So we want to make sure to tell the right story instead of telling someone's story on their own. Let's talk a little bit more about perceptual shortcuts using that same definition of unconscious bias. There are 6 different categories of perceptual shortcuts. And again, we may not even consciously know that we are making assumptions and decisions based on a person because of what we are hearing or what we are seeing about them. Body type is an example. Sometimes we unconsciously, and perhaps sometimes even consciously, we draw conclusions based on a person's appearance, how disciplined they might be, if they could be lazy, as an example, based on their body size. We also, kind of on that beauty bias again, we may make some assumptions about their friendliness or their ability to work with people based on how they look. So these are dangerous areas. And I will tell you, I had my own experience of recognizing an unconscious bias that became conscious to me when I was interviewing last year for our internship program, an individual who was very short in stature. And I heard myself being very aware that I was telling stories about how this person could interact with clients or with prospects. And I had to shut that down instantly and say, Kira, self-talk is important in this instance. You've got to focus on what that individual is saying and the value that they can bring to the organization based on their experience. So this is an example of being aware of a bias, naming it, and slowing down that thinking. And because I know these things, it's often good to have a partner in with the interview and not to interview solo, because then hopefully you can balance off some of those biases. There's also research that shows that the major majority of CEOs in the United States are over 6 foot tall. I think it's somewhere in the 80% range. This would indicate that we're making some assumptions that because someone is over 6 foot tall, that they have characteristics and capabilities to lead an organization or have the capacity, if you will, to be that key decision maker. So there might be assumptions that we're playing, some stereotypes that we're using, and some biases that we're living into based on someone's height. So again, watch those things for yourself when you're making decisions. Our community, our neighbors in the LGBTQ plus community, in terms of some assumptions we might have around sexual orientation. The media often tells stories and creates a playbook that we see members of the LGBTQ plus community hypersexualized in society. And that is a dangerous thing because, again, if you have not gotten to know someone and learned their lived experience, you might be drawing these conclusions that the media culture brings to us. And that's a dangerous thing because the reality is our colleagues, friends, and neighbors in the LGBTQ plus community want intimate relationships just as we do as heterosexual individuals or straight individuals. So it's important for us to keep that in mind. How about an individual's accent? In my diversity honeycomb, I talk about geography and regional differences. What are some assumptions that sometimes we tell ourselves based on a person who might have a Southern accent, who might speak, their cadence might be a little bit slower, or that drawl? Are we making assumptions about their abilities? How about a British accent? Are we making assumptions about their socioeconomic status or their intellect? And how about the regional accent that we hear in the upper Midwest? Are there some positive biases that happen when we hear our Minnesotan or our North Dakotan friends talk with the regional lilt that we have? Making a positive bias can be just as dangerous, that we make assumptions that this person is from Fargo, North Dakota. They are going to be great with people. So keep an eye on assumptions with regards to accent or language. How about age? Right now, so many of our organizations have 5 generations of workers within their workplace, whether it's in the plant, whether it's in the classroom, or in the office setting. And having those different generations is important for us to pay attention to as leaders of organizations or just as colleagues within the office or plant. And sometimes we make assumptions about an individual's age and their ability to change or adapt. How about technology? With our Gen Zers, are we writing the story that they are going to lead us in technology innovations or being able to train us or to use the technology we have? And how about the flip side? Those of us who are older and maybe in the third part of their career, like myself, is Kira really able to use any of this technology? Or gosh, and is she in a leadership role? Is she going to be able to adapt to change as much? So again, are we holding people to these stories about their ability to adapt or to use technology? So watch out what we're thinking about in terms of age. Are we saying that this millennial individual, man, I'm not sure if they can lead our organization with this youth, that they have. Be cautious of those types of decisions because, again, they may not be good for our organizations. Disability is another important one, that we make assumptions oftentimes about a person's cognitive ability, their thinking ability, based on presenting with a physical disability. I know this for myself. Again, this is one of my unconscious biases that I have slowed down and interrupted. When I have historically met an individual in a wheelchair, I find myself amplifying my speech. And I have recognized this about myself. So when I am meeting someone for the first time who presents with a wheelchair, I consciously slow down that thinking and say, Kira, I'm not sure where you got the story that an individual who has a wheelchair is hard of hearing. So I am aware of this and really slow that process down. How about Stephen Hawking? Many of us are familiar with Stephen Hawking. He was one of the most premier astrophysicists this world has ever known. In fact, other scientists created technology to make sure that Stephen, who was physically challenged and also was unable to articulate with speech, other scientists created capacity for his intellect to get out because it was so important. So his cognitive ability was out of this world. So watch out those assumptions we might have for individuals with disability. And then finally, looking at personal traits and recognizing that sometimes, and we've talked about proximity bias, for example, is that extroverted individual can really create opportunity for themselves by going to the power base, using that proximity, creating an opportunity for themselves, and that we've got to make sure that we're creating space for those introverts or for those individuals who are maybe underrepresented that don't feel 100% safe because they don't see themselves in leadership roles yet in organizations. So we want to make sure we don't draw conclusions. As we get to the end of the presentation, I want to talk about privilege. And this is part of unconscious bias and bias in general. And privilege sometimes makes us feel nervous. We get uncomfortable talking about privilege. And as I've said throughout, we've got to say these things out loud because when we speak them, we really create an opportunity to get comfortable in the conversation. And that's important. So when we're talking about privilege, it's really a right or immunity granted because of a specific position. It doesn't necessarily mean role, but it can. Privilege is an advantage. It's a benefit. I like to think of it also as it affords a sense of ease, that it makes it easier for a person who might have privilege to navigate through society in specific ways. It's important to remember that privilege is unearned. For my intersections of privilege, I did little to gain them. Privilege is also not asked for. And it's also important to remember because so many individuals believe that I don't have privilege because I grew up and had a hard life and had to work really hard. Having privilege doesn't necessarily mean that you didn't have challenges. In fact, you can very much have challenges. So let's talk about the intersections of privilege. Privilege can show up in many ways. And I have a few examples of different privileges, and I will let you know I'm not hitting all of them. I'm not talking about gender identity privilege or country of origin privilege as an example, but I want to give you some insight. So gender privilege. If I have children and a successful career, few people ask me how I balance work and home. A decision to hire me will never be based on assumptions about whether or not I might plan to have a family soon. I am less likely to be sexually harassed at work than persons of other gender identities. So this is an example of gender privilege. Race privilege. And throughout the past several months, this is really conversations that have been elevated in many of our communities and in our organizations. Some examples of privilege statements. Children in my racial group do not necessarily have to be educated about systemic racism for their physical safety when they go to school. And I think about sending an 8-year-old kiddo who comes from a Black community to school and educating them on this. That's a huge burden for that kid to have as an 8-year-old, but those are realities that happen in our community. I'm never asked to speak for all the individuals of my racial group. And this is important for us to remember, that one individual's lived experience, perhaps as a Black person, is not going to be the same as other Black people in the community. I can go shopping without concern that employees will monitor me because of my race. Probably throughout the past several months, you have heard individuals talk about their experience of going to stores, or behind the steering wheel when a police officer calls them, that those hands are out. And those are something of other races, maybe we're not having those conversations. How about sexual privilege? If I want to, I can easily find a religious community that welcomes persons of my sexual identity. I can move about in public without a fear of being harassed or physically attacked because of my sexual identity. People don't ask me why I chose my sexual identity. And I think of my privilege as a cisgender, heterosexual, straight person, that if I am going through Menards as an example, I can, with comfort and without even thinking about, grab my partner Lance's hands. And for other sexual orientation identities, this isn't often the ease that they have in society. Ability privilege. I assume that I will easily have access, physical access to any building. For me, as an able-bodied individual, I don't even think about driving up to a building and figuring out how I'm going to physically access that. I definitely have that privilege. I have that ease. If I'm not hired for a job, I don't question if that was due to my physical or mental ability. And when we think of colleagues with hidden disabilities, and I've talked about my mental health issues in the past, someone who has great anxiety preparing for a presentation is not going to be the same as someone who doesn't have that hidden disability or challenge. So it's really important to think about our intersections of privilege. And for those of us working towards equitable and inclusive organizations, using our privilege to exact change. Let's talk briefly about microaggressions and microaffirmations. I'll let you look at the slide and just share some examples. A microaggression is a small statement, a small act that really shows superiority or distrust. And it chinks at an individual's armor, if you will, over time, and can impact their feelings of self-worth and their ability to move forward in certain situations. Those microaggressions might be saying something like, wow, you are really pretty for a Black girl. It might be talking to an individual's therapy dog when they come up with their therapy dog instead of talking with that individual and greeting them. It might be saying, your name is too hard to pronounce. I'm going to give you a different name. So these microaggressions really matter, and they make impacts in our organizations. And it is important to do different and to call them out. The flip side is microaffirmations. And this is really finding a way to lift up an underrepresented individual in your organization, to bring them to the table, to ask their input. And again, these are small, unconscious actions that are about inclusion and equity. My favorite example in my own life is when I reached out to an individual, a young Black professional male in our community. Hadn't met him before, but heard such great things about him. And I asked if I could sit down with him and talk about an idea that I had in the community and get his feedback. And when he and I sat down for the first time, he said to me, the Chief Innovation Officer of Marshall McLennan Agency wants my opinion, wants to hear from me. And to this day, that is something that he shared has made a difference for him in terms of his confidence level and his belief in himself. So these small things, friends, can make a big difference from a positive and a negative aspect. So the impacts of unconscious bias, which I've been unpacking throughout this presentation, here they are in a nice slide. It impacts our talent acquisition and development. We can create missteps, not bringing in the brightest and the best because of some of the biases that we have and stories that we tell, or we're not developing people and putting them on a career path to leadership. Also missed business opportunities. When we think about our customers, our clients, our prospects, the people we serve, we might be missing out because we're making some judgments about who they are as an individual. The homogeneous thinking or myopic thinking that we have when our organizations are not diverse, because we write those individuals out, can really impact our visioning and our strategizing and get in the way of our organization. We've talked about covering in the past, and when we're demonstrating unconscious bias and conscious bias in a workplace, this undermines psychological safety, and it really prohibits our colleagues for showing up wholly as who they are. And that increased covering gets in the way of engagement and gets in the way of productivity. Retention risks. When we are demonstrating our bias and letting that hang out and not learning to do different, individuals may leave our organization because they don't feel included, because they don't feel seen, they don't feel afforded opportunities. And this definitely adds to the expense of rehiring, but it's also important to remember it adds to the chances of our reputation risk, because individuals who leave organizations for bias, for discrimination, for oppression, for missed opportunities are going into the marketplace and telling stories about our organizations. I know this from my experience and individuals sharing these things. So it's a huge risk to our employer brand. So thinking about how can we empower our team to understand their own biases and to do different, and to create organizations that don't allow bias to take place, but to really interrupt it. So I want to leave you with some things to go. There are some great recommended strategies for individuals. Some of these things you've heard before because we're really pulling forward inclusive leadership and how we can start practicing these things. But the reality is the best way to interrupt unconscious bias is to recognize it, name it, and to do different. But when we want to do different, we want to learn about that individual from their lived experience. I can't tell you over the last 6 to 8 months how many individuals I have reached out to who are different than me, coming from a place of genuine interest and relationship building, and to really want to inform my thinking and disrupt my unconscious bias. So for those of you leaning in to becoming a more inclusive leader, here are some behaviors for you to consider. Seeking out and getting to know individuals who are different than you, going places where there is difference, and that you can rub arm to arm with individuals and hear directly from them. Remember, curiosity over suspicion. That's incredibly important. Thinking differently about how you get news, where your media comes from. Are you always going to the same channels, or could you expand the perspectives that are brought into your thinking? Because oftentimes that will inform your unconscious bias to recognize, I've been telling this story and maybe this isn't the accurate one. Include this in your leisure reading and read individuals who are people of color as examples, or from the LGBTQ plus community, or books on religion, different religions, different beliefs. Attend different cultural events and social groups and community events. Put yourself in a place of being uncomfortable because you might be the underrepresented individual. We've talked about naming your biases when you become aware. Some of you might like to journal. This is a great way to get a deeper understanding about where some of these biases might be coming from in terms of our growing up, our culture, the media that we're noticing. and also slowing down our decision making. I've given you some examples where I had the experience of drawing some conclusions about an individual short in stature, and I recognize that. Or I know when I meet someone in a wheelchair, I tend to amplify my voice. I've slowed those things down. Think about your privilege and think about where those intersections are and what it would be perhaps to not have that privilege. And think about some of the individuals in your organization who maybe don't show up with that privilege and have some barriers. What can you do then as an inclusive leader to help remove those barriers and elevate their opportunities? Practicing empathy in this time is incredibly important, that we allow ourselves to look through the world through someone else's vision and their worldview. If you get stuck, it's important to have a coach. When we recognize, I cannot interrupt this bias, I don't understand, I'm really struggling, ask for feedback, seek a close advisor in that. Be aware of microaggressions in your workplaces and in yourself. Apologize for them, own them. That is critically important, and it really repairs relationships and paths forward. So we want to make sure that we change these behaviors. And then I encourage you all to bring forward micro affirmations and large affirmations. Maybe that's having a focus group with individuals of underrepresented populations in your organization. Maybe that's creating a mentor program with new Americans in your industry, going to the Associated General Contractors and saying, we really want to invest in this population, creating ways to hear those underrepresented voices. And as organizations, how about unconscious bias training? So everyone can be empowered to think about this. We want to implement strategies that will foster unbiased, diverse talent acquisition. That is critical to the success of the strategy in any organizations. Know what the biases are in your career pathing and how you choose to develop, mentor, support, and invest in individuals. Create learning and engagement opportunities for your team to learn about different cultures. We just celebrated National Hispanic Heritage Awareness Month, or we're in the midst of that actually. It's September 15th to the middle of October. National Coming Out Day just happened. So lifting up education around that can be important. Confront any microaggressions and biases. Consider alternative communication styles or leadership styles when you're talking with individuals or investing in them. Create opportunities for your team to work with a diverse team, however that might look in your organization, giving others opportunities to get to know people. Check in on your decision making. When you're sitting around the room, it is completely appropriate for an agenda topic to be, if you're creating a strategy, a vision, a process, a practice, to say, okay, is there anything we're missing? Are any biases hanging out here that we need to be aware of? And then finally, reward individuals who are taking this journey to becoming more inclusive and equitable in their practices, that they're saying, I need to do better here as a leader, as a team member, and really empower them on this journey. And then finally, creating shared goals among all people is critical, saying those things out loud. So I've just given you a lot of strategies that you can take to go. And sometimes in this, it can feel very overwhelming. I even know this for me. As a DE&I educator, I get overwhelmed. How can I use my privilege? What can I do differently? How can I be more inclusive and equitable? So I would invite you to think about those strategies as an individual, as an organization, and maybe break it down into one behavior or thought process that you can stop, that you know is getting in the way, that unconscious bias is not advancing equity or inclusion in your organization. Secondly, look through some of those strategies and think about something that you can start. A new behavior, a new way to gather information, a new way to invest in individuals who maybe that you will slow down your affinity bias or your in-group bias, and you will think differently about that. And then finally, if there's something that you are currently doing that's helping and advancing this cause in your organization or as an individual, continue this behavior and maybe share it with another colleague that, I'd like to share something that's been working for me, and I'd like to hear from you what you are doing different. So throughout this presentation, you've heard me talk about awareness, slowing down, naming it, and doing different. You've heard me talk about barriers that get in the way and things that we can do to disrupt our thinking and our behavior. So I would invite you to just begin practicing and give yourself grace and empathy. Find an accountability buddy, colleague who can do this work with you, because it's critically important, but begin to practice it. Sometimes it feels overwhelming. I get that, but it's important work and it is going to make a difference in our organizations. So with that, I am thankful to have this time with you and really look forward in about a week and a half to talk about cultural competencies, what they are and why they are important. When we think about diverse colleagues in our organization, being able to develop behaviors, language, ways to talk with them that honor their cultural differences, having that intercultural competency is going to elevate our organizations and our real ability to do this work in our businesses. So I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for joining me.